Hi guys, happy New Year's Eve. I've been thinking about this video all year long. One of my resolutions this year was to really get back into reading for pleasure, reading for learning, and I didn't really set a goal of how many books I wanted to read. I just wanted to start reading and see how it went. So this year I ended up reading 40 books, 40 in 2018, which I think is a pretty good number. Like, I was gonna raise it for next year and try and do 50, but I think 40 a year is pretty good. It's a little less than a book a week, and that was just manageable for me. I just read in the evenings, pretty much instead of like cleaning and cooking and sleeping. I just read instead. So the only way to read more is just to like neglect some other part of your life. And that's what I do. I neglect all my domestic duties and I just read instead. I kept a bullet journal this year, which I really liked. I think I'm going to continue this into next year. And this is where I wrote down all of the books that I completed in 2018. So let's go through all of them. I will just be brief because I don't want this to be like an hour-long video. And I also don't have all of the books with me because a lot of them I either took to my classroom or just like let friends borrow or gave away or whatever. I don't always keep all the books. So let's get started with all the books I read in 2018. The first one I read last year was Turtles All the Way Down by John Green. I am a John Green fan. I think he makes the internet a better place. I like his books because they always have so much like trivia and interesting information just kind of woven throughout. I don't always love his characters, but I did like Aza. She has OCD just like John Green does. And it was an interesting look into her mind and not being able to control these spiraling thoughts. It's in my classroom now and a lot of my students have read it also. The second book I read was The Financial Diet by Chelsea Fagan. The Financial Diet is also a YouTube channel that I watch, and it has financial information kind of targeted more towards people like me, females, millennials, people who realize that like the traditional rules about money don't necessarily apply when you live in big cities and you have tons of student loan debt. So this is a really good one to read at the beginning of the year. I might pick it up again and go through it again as I'm setting financial goals for 2019. The third book I read was A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle, and I just realized that I hadn't read this book when I was in middle school or whatever, and the movie was coming out. I took a bunch of my students to see the movie after school when it premiered, and I just wanted to read it before that happened. So I really enjoyed it. I love that it is like sci-fi and some of the first sci-fi written by a woman. I like Meg, and it was just cool to read it before the movie came out. The fourth book I read was Forever or a Long, Long Time by Kayla Carter. This book is about a girl in foster care who is trying to kind of piece her memories of her childhood back together. This is a great book for students, and I also think that it's a really important book for teachers to read because you get to see this girl's experience, you know, through the lens of a 4th or 5th grader. She's young, and it's definitely one of those books that just builds compassion and empathy in everybody who reads it. The fifth book that I read this year was The Locust Effect by Gary Haugen, and this was one of the top books of the year for me, the top books ever for me. Gary Haugen is one of the founders of the International Justice Mission, and so if you followed my Dressember journey, the International Justice Mission is one of the main organizations that we give all of the money to. And in The Locust Effect, he talks about how violence against the poor is the biggest problem when we're trying to give aid to people who are impoverished. You can give them food, you can provide water, you can provide things and jobs even, but all of that work is undone by people who prey upon the poor. It really gets into the colonial justice systems in places like India and the reasons why police and even public defenders and courts are ineffective because they were never intended to protect regular people. So this was probably my favorite social justice book of the year. The sixth book that I read was Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. Everything by Brene Brown is wonderful. She has great TED Talks. Daring Greatly wasn't written specifically for teachers, but I feel like so much of it is applicable for like teachers and parents. And it's definitely one that I need to like thumb back through and go look for some like really good quotes to inspire me in the new year. The seventh one is more of a children's book. It's called Schomburg, the Man Who Built a Library by Carol Boston Weatherford. And even though it's a kid's book, there is a lot of text in there. It like takes quite a while to read. And I feel like it's a good model for a book about Rothschild Francis. So I'm definitely holding on to this one, and I'm gonna read it a few more times. And interestingly, a lot of Rothschild Francis's newspaper articles and letters are actually housed in the Schomburg Library. So there are a lot of connections between those two men, and so I wanted to have it for myself and then for Jensen when he's older and able to sit through a book like that, and it might even be one that you read in like several sittings. The first teaching book that I read last year was Teach Like Finland by Timothy D. Walker, and I really enjoyed that book actually, and I think that my school actually does quite a few things similarly to some of the schools in Finland, and it just really emphasizes kind of like slowing down and giving people breaks and giving people time to talk and to think and to reflect and allowing students to really lead a lot of the learning. So much of the book is about like the overall system of education in Finland, and as individual teachers it's harder for us to affect education in a systemic way, and so some of the things aren't applicable to an individual classroom, but I do think it's still worth a read. The next one I read was Dear Martin by Nick Stone. This is one of those YA books that you have to read. If you have any students that really liked They Hate You Give, this one is kind of similar in that it has a kid who is from a poorer neighborhood and he's black and he attends a private school and he kind of has to live in these two different worlds. So those two books go together really well, and I really enjoyed it, and I think kids really liked it too. My husband came home one day and surprised me with two books that he heard about on NPR, and he just thought that I would like them, and he was so right. And I read both of these books within the span of like a week and a half because they were so good. The first one is Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng, and the second one is Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng, and she is just such a great writer. I think my favorite of the two was Everything I Never Told You. I remember thinking that it reminded me a little bit of like This Is Us, where the perspective shifts quite a bit from like generation to generation, and you go back in time like 20 years and you see what life was like for the parents, and then you understand why they are the way they are with their children. And it was just a really interesting look at family and race and expectations and marriage. And Little Fires Everywhere is kind of similar. I recommend them both. I just think Celeste Ng is wonderful. The 12th book that I read was Well Behaved Women Seldom Make History by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, and she is one of my favorite historians of all time. I love everything I've ever read by her, and this one was excellent. It is no exception. She just does history so well. She does research so well, and this is one of my top favorite history books of all time, and she is the one who came up with that phrase, well-behaved women seldom make history, and she wrote this book as a response to that line gaining so much popularity. She had just written it in like a journal article in the 70s or something, and somebody kind of picked it up and it got traction. So this book is just amazing. Book 13 was Of Mess and Moxie by Jen Hatmaker. She's funny. I like her. She's encouraging. I think I sort of prefer following her on Instagram and reading her captions there. She's a very good writer, and I actually got to hear her speak in person this year as well. I like her voice in the Christian community. The 14th book that I read was one of the best I've ever read, The Women in the Castle by Jessica Shattuck. I remember it was April when I read this one. I was on spring break. I picked it up in a grocery store aisle and I could not put it down. It's about these women who are trying to rebuild after World War II. They live in Germany and their husbands are dead, and they are trying to rebuild and like reconcile like what is Germany now, what are our responsibilities now. I love how there are so many books about war now that focus so much on the women's experience, because really they were the ones holding everything together back at home and then rebuilding everything later. And so this one is just written so well, researched so well. It's one that you can't put down. The 15th book I read was Better Than Carrots or Sticks by Doug Fisher, Nancy Fry, and Dominique Smith. I always recommend this as one of my favorite teaching books. I think this is a great one if you are a new teacher just starting out. It has so much information about how to establish restorative justice practices in your classroom, and it just has some of the best, most practical advice that I've ever read in an education book. Number 16 is Crazy Rich Asians by Kevin Kwan. I loved this book and I loved the movie, and it's kind of funny to me that the movie and the book didn't do very well in Asia because they're like, yeah, like we we know all this stuff already. So it's nothing groundbreaking if you already are into Asian media in general, but I think that it was really interesting for those of us in the West who haven't paid as much attention to this, and I love that it got so much traction, that it was so popular here. The books are soap operas for sure. Like, it just gets into all these different characters and all the money that they spend and how petty they are, and it's obviously not like a true realistic slice of the average person's life in Singapore. Everything's really exaggerated, but it's just so much fun and I loved it. And spoiler alert, I read the other two as well. They're coming. Number 17 is A Night Divided by Jennifer Niven. So many people on Instagram recommended this one to me, and this is a young adult historical fiction book, so I love to have those to recommend. And it's about a girl who was on the east side of the Berlin Wall and her father is on the west side. So she and her mom and her brother have to live without him, and they don't know when they're gonna see him again, and it's just a really interesting look at what it would have been like, and that really did happen to people, where families were split in half by this wall that just went up in the middle of Berlin. So this is a great one for your classroom library, and then it's just a really interesting book like for yourself to read also. Number 18 is the book for Dear Evan Hansen. So when we're talking about musicals, the book is like the script, and I had obviously already listened to the soundtrack many times. I like to listen to musical theater soundtracks while I grade, because there's nothing to look at, but then it like still gives me like a story. So I love to listen to a soundtrack and then read the book when it becomes available, because it fills in all of those lines in between the songs and just kind of helps those come to life. So I love having the book version. And this one uniquely also became a novel that I will talk about soon. The 19th book I read was another musical theater book or script, and this one was for In the Heights by QUIARA, Alegria and Lin-Manuel Miranda. Jensen and I listened to this soundtrack pretty much every single day in the car. This is one of my all-time favorite musicals, and so again, I just loved getting like the rest of the story filled in. It explains a little bit more about like Vanessa's background and what's going on with like Benny. It's just one of my favorite stories, and I love the music so much, so those were really fun to read. The 20th book, we're halfway there, was All American Boys by Jason Reynolds and Brendan Keeley. This book is really cool because it's written by two different authors from two different characters' perspectives, but they're both dealing with the after effects of police brutality in their neighborhood. I received this book at a training by Facing History in Ourselves, and we read sections of it and talked about how we could teach it. So this is an excellent one for classroom discussions and just to put in your classroom library. Everything by Jason Reynolds is great, so I highly recommend this one. Okay, since we are halfway in and this light is just really bugging me, we're gonna take a quick break, go refill your coffee, go get a snack, and we'll be right back with 20 more books. 21 was, again, one of my favorite books of the year, so stay tuned. Okay, as I'm editing, I realized that I missed a couple, or at least one. I guess writing books down in a bullet journal isn't really a foolproof way to keep track of them all, but one that I definitely didn't want to leave out was Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Beverly Daniel Tatum. And I read this as part of like an Instagram book club with Britt Hawthorne and Jewel from Anti-Bias Montessori. And they do these book clubs every so often, and they pick really great books, and they have really well thought out like discussion questions about each section of the book, and then they do live videos on Instagram where they discuss like the week's reading. So I definitely recommend getting into some of their book clubs, and this book was excellent, and I highly recommend it for anyone who's an educator or anyone who is a parent. The author is a psychologist, and she studies the development of racial identity, and this is important for kids of all races, whether you're white or mixed or black. This is something that everybody goes through, but at, you know, like kind of varying degrees of success and accuracy. So definitely read this book. I didn't mean to leave it off of the list. This was one of my favorite books of the year and one of my favorite teaching books I've ever read. Okay, hi, we are back to talk about 20 more books before we lose all of the light. Before we had too much light, now we might not have enough. YouTuber problems without professional lighting. Just the sun. Okay. Number 21. Okay, I read this one over the summer. This is Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. Another one of my favorite books I've ever read. If you are interested in social justice, if you're interested in the justice system and how we just kind of like process people through our justice system, you need to read this book. And it's about so much more than that. It's about our humanity and the way that we treat each other as humans and whose lives we decide are important and who is like redeemable. So this was one of the most powerful, most amazing, one of the best books I've ever read. I highly, highly recommend it. Number 22 was The Interestings by Meg Wolitzer. This is the first book I read by her, but I know she is a very well-respected author. The crazy thing about this book is that it wasn't the plot so much that drew me in, the characters I didn't care about all that much, but just the way that she writes is incredible. It was one of those books where it was written so well and she described like everyday occurrences and feelings and senses so well that it makes you more aware of your own surroundings and the things that are happening to you on a daily basis. And literally just by reading her book, it made my real life more poetic. You know what I mean? So this year I want to read more by her. Number 23, So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. This is a book that I have recommended many, many times since reading it. If conversations about race kind of confuse you, or if you get into a lot of conversations where people are confused about race, this is definitely a book to read. This is just something that like every American should have to read. It just breaks down a lot of kind of, you know, buzzwords and things like privilege, sensitive topics like hair and the N-word. Just a really, really important book that you should read if you haven't already. Number 24 was China Rich Girlfriend by KWAN. This is the second in the Crazy Rich Asians series. The second was my least favorite of the three. It was just a little like gratuitous. It was just, the plot wasn't really there. It was just all the things that people were buying. This one centers more on like Kitty Pong, and it's fine. It's an escapism type of a book, but my least favorite of the three. Number 25 is called Under the Painted Sky by Stacey Lee. This is another young adult historical fiction novel. I loved it. The main characters are a Chinese girl and a black girl who are traveling west from like Chicago or something, I think, and so they have to dress as boys for protection, and it just shows a much more realistic, much more diverse view of what it was like during like westward expansion and the time of cowboys and stuff like that. And I think this is a really great book for students to read. And another Asian author, I think this was like the year of Asian authors for me, and they knocked it out of the park. Number 26, and I'm just, you know, have written them here, and so I forget what the full title is, but The Eleanor Oliphant something something by Gail Honeyman. This was another one of those books where the writing is just so strong that it really pulls you into her world. They never really define what's kind of happening in her brain, but she's maybe autistic on the spectrum. She doesn't really pick up social cues, but she's really funny. You really learn to love her, and I definitely enjoyed this book. 27 is The Late Homecomer by Kalia Yang, and in our 8th grade English textbook we had an excerpt from this story, but I just felt like the excerpt didn't give me enough about what I wanted to know, so I decided to read the whole book so that I would be able to teach that one excerpt better, and then I actually ended up finding much better sections of the book to use in class. It's a really interesting story. It's a memoir about a family who lived through the Hmong genocide, and then they were in Thailand in a camp and then moved to Minnesota, and it's a very important story about the Hmong people and just their journey as refugees. And my students got really into this, and we ended up talking about refugees and diversity within Asians and being an ethnic minority, and it just brought up so many interesting discussions. So I highly recommend this one as well. 28, so good. There by Tommy Orange. Tommy Orange is a Native American author. He's sort of, I mean, like, I hate to say this, but he's kind of like the new Sherman Alexie. There's a lot of controversy going on with Sherman Alexie right now, and so he was another author like in that unit of study in our book, and we chose to just expand beyond him and read more Native American authors. There is really good. It's about all of these different Indian people who live in Oakland, so it's kind of like the urban Native experience, and it's from, I don't know, like 12 or 13 different perspectives, and at first you can't really understand how they're all connected, but in the end there's a powwow and they do all connect. There's a lot of tragedy, a lot of poetry, a lot of beauty, a lot of history in this book, and I highly recommend it. 29 was The Way I Used to Be by Amber Smith. and I hated this book. I wanted to read it because I thought that the perspective was important. It's from the perspective of a girl who was raped her freshman year of high school, and then like it's in 4 parts, like freshman, sophomore, junior, senior year. Just wasn't well written. I didn't feel like the story like redeemed itself in any way. It was too gratuitous. I didn't like it, unfortunately. I wouldn't recommend it. But after that, I read The Roundhouse by Louise Erdrich, and really this story is kind of similar. It is about a Native woman who is raped, and it's kind of through the perspective of her son and trying to figure out what happened to her. And they live on a reservation, and it gets into like the jurisdiction of who protects these people, who is responsible, and how do the laws overlap, and where are they just completely lacking. It's beautifully written. Again, it's a story of tragedy, but there's so much beauty in it. And in general, I love this author. I want to read like everything that she has ever written. Number 31 is the novel version of Dear Evan Hansen by Val Emick, and this does not always happen, but they decided to take the story of Dear Evan Hansen from the Broadway musical and turn it into a novel. And it's a little bit different than the novel. It goes much more deeply into Connor's backstory, and it really fills in a lot that I don't even know if it just got like cut out of the play or if it was like added later, but it's really interesting. And if students aren't used to reading like the book version, like the script version, but they want to read more of this story, then now there's the novel version. It's really good. There is kind of some PG-13 rated stuff in there, but it's a very good book. Number 32 is Raise Your Voice by Kathy Kang. I saw her speak in person and I loved her, and I wanted to just read more about her ideas. She's a Christian author, she's Korean American, and she was really one of the people who pointed out in her talk that I got to attend about how as Christians we read so much by white authors. Like Christian bookstores are just full of white authors all the time and white voices all the time. So to read things from her perspective was so refreshing and so just fulfilling, really. And I think this is her only book right now, but if she comes out with another one, I will read it right away. I think I've bought 4 copies of this book and I keep giving them away. And I think it's really important, whether you're Asian American or not, to read from her perspective. The next book I read was A Very Large Expanse of the Sea, and I'm gonna mispronounce the author's name, Tahereh Mafi. This is another young adult fiction book from the perspective of a girl whose family is from Iraq, I believe, and she wears the hijab and she loves breakdancing. She's really funny, she's really witty. It's so cool to have a book from this protagonist perspective. It's not as common as it should be. So this is definitely one that I put into my classroom library. It was really good. I think I would have enjoyed it more like as a teenage girl, because it's just very well suited in that young adult fiction genre. So for teenagers, it's perfect. For me, it was decent. It was just kind of like a fun read, but definitely a good one to add to your classroom library. Number 34 was Rich People Problems by Kevin Kwan, and this is the 3rd installment of the Crazy Rich Asians series. I really liked this one because it got more into the history of Nick's grandmother and grandfather, and I actually wish they had gone even more deeply into their history. In fact, I just kind of want him to write just historical fiction based on, you know, the war in Singapore with Japan, and I would just like to know so much more about that. So I really enjoyed the 3rd one, and I hope that he like continues to bless us with his books. Number 35 was another one of the best books that I read this year, and a book that I'm going to return to over and over. It's called Still Evangelical. It's edited by Mark Laberton, and there are like 13 or 14 different essays within it, all from different kind of leaders in the evangelical community. It's a very diverse group of leaders. It's kind of in response to the reluctance to identify as a white evangelical after the 2016 election, just because of the blatant sinfulness of the president that we elected and the disconnect that we see between like Christian values and Republican values. It's just a difficult situation. There's a lot of hurt from people who voted both ways and yet still belong to the same like body of Christ. So this was an incredible book. I loved reading from all of these different perspectives. This year, really, women of color like saved my faith in humanity. They've been the leaders, they've been the strong voices, they've been bringing people together, and they do the same thing in this book. It's interesting. It was just interesting to me reading the different essays, and the women of color had the best essays. They just wrote the best and they had the best ideas. The men of color also wrote pretty well and had some really interesting ideas. And then there were several white authors who also had good ideas, but their writing was just nowhere near the caliber of the other authors in this book. And it was just kind of an example to me of the privilege of kind of resting on your laurels a little bit and not having to prove yourself every second of your life. So I know that this book isn't applicable to all that many people, but if you are one of those people that's like struggling with an identity as an evangelical, this is what you need to read for sure. Number 36 is Uprising by Margaret Peterson Haddix. This was one of the books that we read in our literature circles with my 8th graders. It's about girls who work in New York City during the reform movement after the Industrial Revolution. They're striking for workers' rights. They work at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. It's a very tragic story, obviously, but my students loved it. I loved it. This is another great YA historical fiction recommendation. And 37 is another very similar book. It's called Ashes of Roses by MJ Auch, and the women in this story also work in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. We had 5 different books in our literature circle collection, but if you just did 2, you could do these 2 books, and they align really, really well. They have different plots, but kind of similar characters and similar conflicts, and then they both end similarly and tragically, but these 2 books were both great and my students loved them. They were upset by them, but they're definitely books that you want to keep in your classroom. Number 38 was Vox by Christina Dalcher. This one was probably marketed to me more than any other book this year besides Girl Wash Your Face. I just kept seeing it like pop up like in my Amazon suggestions and in magazines and stuff, so I picked it up. It has like an interesting premise. A really conservative government takes over and women are only allowed to speak 100 words a day. It just, I don't know, it wasn't that well written. It really lacked subtlety. Just read The Handmaid's Tale instead. This one I wouldn't really recommend. To cleanse my palate after that, book number 39 was If You Leave Me by Crystal Hannah Kim. This was another incredible book. This was sort of, you know, what I was wishing for from Kevin Kwan, a historical fiction novel. This one is set in Korea during and after the Korean War. And as Americans, we don't know much about the Korean War. Like, we learn about like the 38th parallel, and that's about it. We just kind of hear things from our perspective. So this one's sort of similar to like The Women in the Castle, in that it looks at, you know, women's perspectives and men's, but when you see the women who have to like hold the country together while the men are fighting, you see what life was really like during the war. And this book is interesting because, again, it's from like multiple perspectives and across quite a few years. It's about gender, it's about class, it's about money, it's about marriage, it's about depression, it's about mental health, it's about upward mobility, it's about government, it's about Korean history. It's just really, really interesting. So this is one of, again, the best books that I read this year. Oh, I do have this one right here. This is the only one that I have like at my fingertips. Oh, and then you know who wrote praise for this book on the back is Jessica Shattuck, author of The Women in the Castle. So they do have kind of a similar niche in their writing, but to see feminism and gender explored through the lens of women in Korea was very interesting. And again, just Asian authors knocking it out of the park. Almost all of the best books that I read this year were by Asian authors, so don't sleep on them. Number 40 is Good Morning and Good Night by Lin-Manuel Miranda. I read this as soon as I got it. It's been a while. I pre-ordered it and it came right away, but this book is just a compilation of his good morning and good night tweets. I didn't realize that so many other people loved them as well. For a couple years now, I've had a poster of one of his good morning tweets, and it's our little morning chant that I say every day with my students, and apparently lots of people love those. So he got together with an illustrator. It has just like really cute illustrations within it, and it's just such an uplifting collection of Lin-Manuel Miranda's tweets. I admire him so much because he's always so positive. I mean, he's so creative, and he's written all of my favorite stuff, In the Heights, Hamilton, even Moana, Jensen's favorite stuff, and he's just continually gracious with people and kind to people and funny, and he's really the type of person that I want to be. He is an influence for good in this world, and he fights for justice and for equality, but he does it in such a kind and creative and graceful way. And I think he's just a great example to all of us. So that is definitely a book recommendation from 2018. There were so many good ones this year, only a couple of duds. I really love doing book chats. I love talking about books. I have an idea for another book chat that I might do like later this week. Please tell me down below if you can decide your favorite book that you read this year. I'm always taking more recommendations, even though I have a bunch all right here in front of me. And if you have a minute, please also leave me a comment about what other types of book videos you would like me to do, because this is one of my favorite types of videos to make, is just to talk about books. It's so much fun to me. If you don't already follow my book Instagram, it's at Too Cool for Middle School Books. And I have like written reviews of almost all of these books as well. So you can follow along there for more frequent updates about what I'm reading. But it was kind of fun to save all of these until the end of the year. Thank you so much for your support in 2018. I will see you guys in 2019. Happy New Year.